Hello again, everyone. I'm Dr. George Simon, and welcome to another edition of the new Character Matters program. This is the program where we talk about what I consider to be the defining issue of our time, the character crisis that we've been in for some time now, and that affects every aspect of our lives. Times were when most folks seeking counseling of some type, what we have traditionally called therapy. Times were when most of those folks seeking that kind of help were individuals struggling with inner anxieties, fears, unconscious, unresolved conflicts that were making them sick, that were causing them distress. That still happens, of course, but increasingly these days, most folks thought to need the most therapy are individuals struggling with deficiencies of character. And probably struggling is not the right word either. And because I'm a stickler for accuracy in terms, I should rather say that they are individuals who have not mastered the essential principles of developing integrity of character. The principles that I outline both in my book, Character Disturbance, and my latest book, Essentials for the Journey. And there are aspects of a person's developing character that can really interfere with the process of developing the kind of integrity that we'd like most folks to have. I mentioned on the program that I posted just before my Thanksgiving message that integrity of character is largely related to forming a mature, healthy conscience. But there are some impediments to that occur along characterological lines. As folks are developing in their sense of self, and as they are fashioning for themselves a preferred way of operating in the world, developing their character, that is, there are certain things that can interfere with developing a sound and healthy conscience. And the two main things that interfere with that are solidifying too many narcissistic traits in one's personality and too many aggressive personality traits in one's personality. And I'll explain the difference. And this is really important. These days, there's a lot of talk about narcissism. There's some good information out there, and there's some not so good information out there because of the tendency to overgeneralize. Indeed, there's so much talk about narcissism these days that it's hard to appreciate the fact that it was not that long ago that those charged with officially classifying and categorizing personality disorders, a committee on the topic for the American Psychiatric Association's official manual of mental disorders, discussed eliminating the category altogether. And at least one of the reasons for that has been the traditional difficulty that professionals have had appropriately assessing the essential elements of the condition, how to accurately define it, what the prospects are for intervention. But anyone who's had to live with a narcissist knows all too well that the condition is real. And it is true that inconsistencies still abound with respect to defining the narcissistic aspects of character. And there's still some ambiguity when it comes to understanding narcissism and its roots and its manifestations. These days, however, we've gone to the opposite extreme. We're no longer on a crusade to eliminate this classification of personality, but rather, these days, almost everyone seems to be a narcissist or have narcissistic tendencies, and also, very unfortunately, Around every corner is an expert on narcissism. And you will see all kinds of things on social media about narcissist this and narcissist that, as if this was a one-dimensional phenomenon. It's not. There are many different types and degrees of narcissism. It's a dimension of personality, and it's not to say that there aren't narcissistic personality disorders, but they differ as to type and degree. Not every narcissist, for example, is devoid of empathy or devoid of empathy capacity. Not every narcissist revels in the hurting of others. There are different types and degrees, and with different implications, not only for relationships, but also for one's potential to grow in character. Having narcissistic traits in your personality is going to inhibit you from developing solid character. Why? Because one of the more common features of narcissism is an inflated sense of self, whether it's compensatory or not. Sometimes it's compensatory. Other times it's not. And when a person thinks too much of oneself, there's no room in the heart for serving something bigger. And that's largely what developing a sound conscience is all about. It's being subordinate to something bigger. And individuals with narcissistic tendencies in their personality have a hard time developing conscience simply because they can't even imagine something bigger than them, let alone having the heart to serve that something bigger than them. So narcissism is one major impediment to developing a sound conscience. But there's a variety of narcissists that I describe in my books In Sheep's Clothing, Character Disturbance, The Judas Syndrome, and How Do We End Up Here? There's a variety of narcissists that I call the aggressive personality. Pure narcissists by nature see themselves as above the general conventions, the rules, and the authorities that most people respect. They set their own rules. But the aggressive personalities, the ones that I describe in my books, pit themselves against the norms, rules, standards. It's more than just feeling above. It's being at war. In the heart is an abhorrence of subordination to a higher set of governing principles, to a higher power, if you will, to something bigger. Traditionally, psychologists and social workers and all manner of mental health professionals have assumed that no one would so abhor the idea of self-subordination unless they had somehow in their formative years come to fear it. But this is not always true. As a matter of fact, these days, it's most often not true. Some folks have an innate detest. So, if they see themselves above anything bigger, and if they also abhor the notion of subordinating themselves, they're going to have an extremely difficult time forming any kind of healthy conscience. I like to say in my workshops a little rhyming phrase: internalization of a prohibition is ultimately an act of submission. I'll repeat that. Internalization of a prohibition is, at heart, a subordination. And the haughty among us and the defiant among us don't subordinate easily or willingly. And that's why they don't internalize the things that we want them to. the principles of conduct that we want them to. It's not that they don't see. This is how therapists and relationship partners waste incredible time and energy trying to get folks to see what they already see. Folks have told them 1,000 times what they'd like to see different in the way they operate. They get it. Believe me, they get it. It's not that they don't see, it's that they disagree. They prefer their way, their view, their standards, their values. They don't want to be subordinate, either because they think they're above, superior, and don't have to because they're so special, or because they have this innate defiance, this abhorrence of the notion. It feels awful. They don't like it. And that doesn't mean they necessarily fear it. Most of us can make space in our heart for caving into some things. We internalize certain prohibitions because we serve something bigger. Yes, somebody says something really upsets us, and we feel like doing something many times. Maybe not so good, but then we pause and we think about the consequences, the bigger picture. We think about values and standards. That's something bigger too. And when we refrain from doing what part of us wants to do, what we have the impulse to do, we are willfully subordinating ourselves to something bigger. And that's how you develop a conscience. So the two great impediments to character integrity, which involves necessarily a healthy conscience, are an inflated sense of self associated with narcissistic tendencies in a person, and the defiance that comes along with the aggressive personalities. And in coming programs, I'm going to be talking a lot more about the aggressive personalities because these days everything is about narcissism. And as I mentioned before, not all narcissism is the same. And in fact, with respect to some types of narcissism, they are relatively benign conditions when compared to the aggressive personalities. So I'll be having a lot more to say about that and about the problems this causes in a relationship and about the difficulties posed when someone goes for help or when folks with aggressive personality disturbances are referred for such things as anger management and other programs. You can't effectively treat what you don't really understand. Many of you have heard the saying that if you want to remove the speck from your brother's eye, you have to remove first the plank in your own. That is, if you're going to see clearly how to assist someone else in doing better, seeing better, being better, then you better have your own frame of mind and your own vision clear. And unfortunately, there are so many misconceptions that cloud our judgment. It's very hard, even as a therapist. Even a well-trained therapist, especially therapists trained in all those techniques that don't really apply and can't really help individuals with character disturbances. So I'll have much more to say in an upcoming series on the aggressive personalities, beginning with the next podcast on character matters. And until then, I thank you for tuning in. I urge you to avail yourself of my books, In Sheep's Clothing, the international premier book on manipulative personalities and the phenomenon of gaslighting, Character Disturbance, the Phenomenon of Our Age, the book that explains all of the various character disturbances and the difficulties involved in relationships with these folks and what you can do, and especially what you need to consider when seeking help. The Judas Syndrome, How Did We End Up Here? A Guide to Surviving and Moving On in This Character Disturbed World of Ours, and my latest offering, Meant for Everyone, because we can all grow in character, even if we're fairly decent sorts. Essentials for the Journey, Embracing and Living the 10 Commandments of Character, Proven Principles for Psychological, Emotional, and Spiritual Health, and all the free articles on my blog at drgeorgesimon.com. So until next time, when we begin the series on the aggressive personalities, thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. George Simon. Take care.